So what today's about is seeing what some of those lessons from 2020 have been, and what does that mean for the future. And that could be within passenger transport, but also about the wider issues for the communities that we serve. And a lot of talk about building back better. And our question is, well, what does that look like for us? So as with all these events, we've got a great lineup of speakers. We've asked them to think about their worlds, the work that they do, and what lessons might be drawn out for you and your work. And look forward to hearing from them in a moment. First, I'm going to ask Rachel, my colleague, to just share some housekeeping issues with you.
Hi, good afternoon, folks. It's the same as it always is. Please do share your ideas and thoughts in the chat. When you're using chat and webinar, you need to set it so that all panelists, but also other participants can see. So if you want everyone to be able to interact, please do that. Please also make use of the Q&A function so you can put questions directly to panelists. If there is a question that we want to ask you to speak on, I'll just ask you to raise your hand so I can find you in the list, and then I'll enable you to speak. We thought just to kind of get a bit of a capture of the year that we've just had, we would put up a wee poll. This won't be, it's just a wee bit of fun really, about things that you might have done in 2020. So we'll collect the result of this at the end. That's just launching there now. As always, this event will be recorded. So if there is anything you think afterwards you want to know more about, do just look for the recording on our website. Thank you, Bill. I'll hand back over.
Thank you, Rachel. Yes, I've been distracted by that poll. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing this screen now, our welcome screen, and ask our first speaker to start getting ready with their presentation. So the first speaker we're going to hear from today is Dr. Mark Beecroft. He's a programme coordinator for the MSc in Transport and Intelligent Mobility and a lecturer in Transport Studies at the University of Aberdeen. And his interests include personal security and travel, transport technologies and user needs, transport futurology, transport policy and intelligent transport systems. So we're really delighted to have Mark with us today, who's going to share some what he's been learning over the last year and thoughts about the future. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you for this opportunity to talk to you. So yeah, I've just been, reflecting, as Bill said, on over the year and thinking about what have we learned from it. And there are two kind of areas I wanted to focus on in the time I have available looking at 2020 in transport. And they were really around planning for the future, so how we do that, and also the relationship between transport and health. These are kind of areas where I've been, I suppose, thinking most about, particularly in relation to the degree programme that I've been running this year, looking at transport and intelligent mobility. With students there thinking about what we learned from 2020. And in terms of looking at planning for the future, just as a bit of background, my career in transport research began in March 2000, so 20 years ago, pretty much. And I was started by working on a project called the Transport Visions Network. And that project was all about generating visions for the future of transport for a 2020 time horizon. It was a collaborative project with lots of people involved. And whilst we certainly didn't predict what has happened in 2020, we did, in the course of that scenario work, generate some thinking that has proved quite prescient. So, for example, we recognised that working practices were going to be important in the future, and that there may be alternative ways in which they would take place, based around sort of scenarios of workplace to the workers or workers to the workplace, those kinds of things. And they've proved appropriate. I think we've seen in this year a massive increase in teleworking, which of course teleworking has been predicted to increase for decades as technology has enabled it to. It obviously has taken the force of the pandemic to really make that a reality for many people. And this work we did was around the same time that a lot of work was going on 2020 visions around the millennium turn, particularly government projects. And it led me to think around this quote from Bradfield and Nell Said, who do a lot of work on scenario planning, to say, we live in an age of uncertainty and turbulence and discontinuity. And the danger in this is not the turbulence itself, well, that is a danger, but the greatest danger is acting with yesterday's logic. So when I'm thinking about how do we approach and plan the future, it leads me towards this notion of scenario planning, because I think it can help us to get away from some of the tendency to inertia in our decision making. We know and we're familiar with the status quo, and we tend to think that things will just kind of incrementally progress from there. But sometimes this confidence can be misplaced, that things will just, be business as usual. And that 2020 has shown us that about anything else, I think. So by thinking in terms of different scenarios, we start to get away from relying on a single future, a single strategy, and experimenting with the future by thinking about different possibilities. Then it gives us a more robust approach to planning in the short term and the long term, because we can start to see, well, actually, we have to be prepared for alternative eventualities. So we need to have quite a range of alternatives. We can't predict the future in the way we might like, certainly in the medium to long term. Even in the short term, we wouldn't have predicted what's happened in 2020, even a year prior to that. So this idea of scenario planning as an approach and a research approach has sort of gained currency over the years, and there's a lot of linkages between people doing scenario planning and significant environmental instability or discontinuity. So, for example, a lot of the early work around scenario planning in the 1970s, led by people like Shell, really came out of the oil crisis at that time. So I would say that we're kind of approaching, or we're in a major discontinuity at the moment in terms of how we live our lives. There are other discontinuities around carbon and other areas that also point towards the need to prepare more robust alternative visions for the future that aren't just based upon business as usual. And so one of the messages I would say from 2020 for me is we need to invest time and effort in collaborative scenario planning across the transport sector as a whole, but also within specific parts of that sector, including, say, community transport, I would say, to give us more confidence in being able to manage the future developments. So that was one of the two themes I was thinking. The other two theme is obviously this one around transport and health. And we have a growing understanding, I think, that there are environmental and social impacts from transport that have public health consequences. And health is really at that intersection between environmental and social issues in sustainability. One of the common ways of thinking about sustainable transport sustainability is to think about three pillars: economic, environmental, and social sustainability. And health is always sat somewhere in amongst that environment and social issues, I guess. And there's a list here of various things that have commonly come out in research as key topics between transport and health. Many of these will be familiar to you all, I'm sure. But I'm obviously going to just concentrate on the last of these points, the one around the role of transport in disease transmission and control, including major health events, so pandemics, as the main focus. But we all know that noise and air pollution has impacts both on physical and mental health. Safety has always been a traditional area of research as a key health impact. We know that promoting active travel and use of travel is that active modes generally promotes healthier lifestyles and builds community as well, as in terms of that social importance of meeting together, traveling together, doing things together. All have very important beneficial consequences in terms of health and well-being. So when we look at major health events, we can see that pandemics are kind of at the intersection between biological and man-made activity, with profound ramifications, as we've seen. But it's incredibly difficult to assess risk in this regard. The pandemics are rarely directly do they damage transport systems, but they're intimately linked. both because transport is a vector for the diffusion of pandemics, as we've seen that in this case, especially aviation. And you might say that it's one of the unintended consequences of hypermobility, of our very mobile lifestyles. And the figure here on the right hopefully illustrates that with the map showing how within 6 weeks you've gone from a reasonably localized distribution of cases in mid-January to almost a global coverage by the end of March, showing how our mobility and lifestyles are kind of a key aspect of the development of pandemics. And when we think about transport impacts, I was just trying to list some of the impacts, and there's so many that it's hard to gauge them all, but obviously there's been disruption to transport services and supply chains, and we're seeing that, I guess, particularly at the moment in terms of the concern around our ports, linked also perhaps to Brexit, but around maritime transport, but we see it in other areas as well. We saw in the early parts of lockdown that there seemed to be improvements in terms of air pollution into where you had serious, severe lockdowns. That's varied since, obviously. We've seen the phenomenon of the active discouragement of travel, which is something that I guess none of us have expected or anticipated before. And this clearly has particular impacts on people's independent mobility and their social inclusion. And this is especially of concern to people in vulnerable groups, particularly the kind of groups that are served by community transport, perhaps, so older people, people with mobility impairments. But we've also seen wider impacts around the aviation sector and tourism, and that substitution for the travel that comes through the encouragement of virtual mobility, through the kind of things we're doing today, having online communication to replace physical meetings. But parallel to that discouragement of travel generally, there has been an encouragement of active travel to a level that we haven't really seen before in terms of the commitment and investment as well. So we see road space reallocation, for example, on a scale that we haven't seen perhaps before, and investment in infrastructure. There is a question mark about how temporary that is, how permanent that will be. Certainly in Aberdeen, we've had concerns where a new cycle route was put into the city around the beach area and then withdrawn because of the objections of motorists particularly. And then collective transport, in particular, the focus, I guess, of most of the concerns of this audience. So we've seen the active discouragement of collective forms of transport in a way that has gone against, the way we've approached things for decades. We've always, the implication has always been that public transport should be encouraged for sustainability reasons. But that's now, we've had a kind of turn against that for clear health reasons. I mean, this is challenging our traditional models of service provision, the kind of vehicles we use, the kind of infrastructure we use. Even with a vaccine and with the positive future likely, we still don't know the full ramifications of that. Implications for community transport, again, linking to public transport really in terms of the limitations on mobility, and particularly around that social inclusion concerns and the links that can have to physical and mental health, and impacts on the sharing economy more broadly, on the kind of services and transport services that have been emerging in recent years around bike sharing, micro-mobility, ride-hailing, collective taxis, all these kind of innovative approaches to sharing transport. How sustainable are they at the moment? Those concerns. And this figure just shows some of the early results and evidence on this. This is looking at New York subway and New York city bike ridership in that first main month of the pandemic in March. And we can see on the graphs on the side, as the pandemic on the red line increases, use of both subway and city bikes declined very sharply. Conscious I'm pretty much up to my time, so I'll just nip to my final slide. So my lessons learned from 2020 really around this planning for the future, recognizing that when you have big discontinuities, it shows you can't just plan on a business as usual basis. We need to invest in thinking about doing scenario planning in the longer and shorter term that's more robust. And around this increasing focus on transport and health as a domain within transport policy and planning. and that collective and shared modes are critical to sustainability of our networks. So how you manage that in this health context is a challenge, of course. And how we undertake our mobility is sort of subject to disruption and may not return to normal. I'll stop talking there because I'm conscious I'm going over my time.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for that, Mark. Really appreciated that look at how the pandemic has affected transport in many different ways, and particularly that focus on our local, kind of very local services that our members would provide. And I think, you know, I appreciate that call to action as well around there needing to be more collaboration across a sector. And I think you also said in your talk within a sector about how we might address some of those wider, more systemic long-term problems. So thank you very much for that. I'm going to now we'll take questions and comments from the audience right at the end once we've heard from all three of our panelists. Our next one is Ali McInroy. He's the Chief Executive of Technology Scotland. As we've seen over the last few months, you know, there's been much more interesting conversation around, you know, what role does technology play, both in managing response to the pandemic, but what will it play in the future? So I'm really glad that we've got Ali along today to share some ideas with us about this. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill, and thanks for the invitation along today as well. I mean, you pointed out at the start, it's been a really interesting and challenging year for anybody really involved in transport. And I guess why I'm here today is to talk a little bit about the potential, not just potential, but where technology, I guess, has been managing some of that impact over the last 9 months or so, but also where it's going to help us to kind of phase and transition back to whatever that new normal might be, and try and do it in the most kind of sustainable and efficient way possible. So if I start just by reflecting briefly back on 2020, and I won't spend too much time on this because Mark's already covered this extremely well, but it's been said numerous times, it's been unprecedented, hasn't it? No one really could have foreseen this coming, and you know, the way that we have engaged with transport in the last year has been extraordinary, really, or haven't engaged, I guess, would be a better way of putting it. Travel patterns have been severely restricted for obvious reasons. When you're told not to leave your house, then that tends to have that impact. And within that, there's been a really kind of marked change in the demand patterns for transport as well, fueled by people obviously more working from home and just different travel patterns more generally over the last 9 months. A more worrying trend, but obviously an understandable one, is that shared transport use has dropped, and that's pushed greater demand onto the private car. On a more positive note, we might argue there's been a greater focus on localization and this concept of that 20-minute neighbourhood, and having everything, you know, making sure that everybody has access to their at least immediate requirements within a short geographical area, which is great. Mark touched on the changes that we've seen to our urban areas in terms of redesigning and repurposing for, you know, increased pedestrian access or better active travel infrastructure. And we have, at least towards the beginning of the pandemic, we saw that increase in walking and active travel, although I dare say the fantastic spring weather that we had probably had something to do with that. I suspect the active travel in Glasgow in December is not any higher than it was last year, would be my guess. So yeah, so what's the role of technology in all this? Well, very simply, I would say what we want to do is try and support the positive trends that we've seen over the last 9 months and try and counteract those negative ones. And I think in particular that shift back towards dependence on the private car. We know for environmental and health reasons that is not a good thing. We had good momentum before the pandemic hit, I think, around climate change agenda, etc. But we also know that inherently a society that's dependent on the car is one that's going to be inherently unequal. And we have to make sure that we can avoid that. So I'm going to talk about technology more broadly, but I'm going to start by talking about a concept called mobility as a service, because that's our particular focus through our Mass Scotland network within Technology Scotland. Now, I know this might be a new concept to some of you. I suspect there'll be a concept for a lot of you that you're aware of, but perhaps don't see it as being particularly relevant. And I understand that, because I think often the way that mobility as a service is articulated we tend to talk about it in its most expansive, it's all singing, all dancing format, which I think actually in many cases is not relevant. And I think that can often put off stakeholders or those who might be able to play a part. So having said that, I'm going to start with that kind of definition of it just to frame it, but then drill down to perhaps where it might be more relevant to this particular audience. So mobility as a service is a data-driven concept, ultimately. It's all about information. And at its very basic level, it's about taking all the information associated with the transport modes in a particular area. So that can be your public transport modes, but also things like car clubs, bike schemes, taxis, and indeed community transport. And bundling all that information together in a big ball of data and then presenting it back to the passenger in a way that allows them to make the most informed travel decision they can make at any particular time on any particular day. Now, obviously, the mode mix there will change depending on what area that you're operating in. Modes will be restricted or otherwise. But the key is that I think there is a role for community transport within that. In certain geographical areas, it is an absolutely essential mode. And for particular people, it's an absolutely essential mode. But it's part of that broader mix. The second bit is the difficult bit, which is the payment bit. And that's to allow people to, once they have planned their journey through all these multiple modes, is to allow them to execute payment on it. And that gets into very difficult territory and it's often some of the barriers towards the ultimate implementation of this. And the third piece is the journey management piece. And this is really important, I think, in a post-COVID world. This is around helping people to not just plan their journey and pay for it, but kind of negotiate and navigate their journey as it's going on and make changes required. So that includes basic things like cancellations and congestion and delays and that type of thing. But it could include all sorts of other things as well. This is a slightly outdated slide, so it's focused on things like air quality and weather and things like that. But in a post-COVID world or in the COVID transition, you can well imagine that people will be looking for information around, say, things like the capacity of the bus that's coming their way, when was the last time perhaps it went through a deep clean, these types of things. Ultimately, what all this is about is trying to, I guess, rebuild confidence in that shared transport network by giving people as much information as they can to allow them to do that. And the final piece of that jigsaw is the personal data piece. And this is around, this personalisation aspect of MaaS is often discussed. Clearly, anything that involves shared transport can't be 100% personalised. That's obvious. But the way that the choices are presented to you and the way that you engage with it can be. And that can take into account your particular travel preferences related to cost or carbon footprint or time, or it might be around your own personal needs and accessibility needs, for example, as part of that mix. So it's about trying to encourage that modal shift as much as possible into these shared and more sustainable modes away from the private car. That's the ultimate goal of it. So I can understand you might say, well, okay, that sounds brilliant, but I'm not sure that it's relevant, and I understand that. But some of the aspects that lie underneath that umbrella may be, and there are all sorts of technological developments and solutions that are part of that MaaS jigsaw, if you like, that are very much relevant. So things, for example, like dynamic services, we're seeing that more and more now, particularly in light of COVID, where traditional travel demands have gone out the window and may never come back because people are travelling at different times. Flexible working is going to be a key thing beyond the pandemic as well. And fixed route, large bus, services may just not cut the mustard when it comes to providing that sustainably and efficiently. So flexible services, real-time booking of vehicles and real-time dynamic routing is going to allow for much more efficient services and much better services for people who are using them. And that can apply into public transport or community transport or taxis, car share schemes as well. There's also this idea of making better use of the spare capacity. I've been told often, and this often occurs in rural discussions, they'll say there are enough vehicles around, they're just not doing the right thing. But if there is a way of better managing them, public transport, community transport, schools transport, maybe even certain types of freight transport, to pull all that together and effectively match bums to seats, match where the capacity is and allow that to fill those gaps in the services. And that's particularly important where the modes don't really exist. So that's a really important bit, and technology is there to allow us to do that. The third one is all these different modes will ultimately have to integrate with the main transport arteries. We know that, the main roads, the main rail networks, etc. And that builds the concept of the mobility hubs, which plays nicely to the localization theme. of building these modes around a particular hub and then building things around about that, be it shared office space, cafes, etc. That can be managed through technology-based platforms as well. And then for the car clubs and community volunteer services, there's platforms that provide that, as I say, that greater efficiency of use in terms of booking, efficiency of route management, efficiency of payments, even that type of thing. So there's all that that's part of it. And then just to touch on it last, maybe slightly less relevant, is that managing that functionality as we kind of adapt our particularly urban spaces, but suburban spaces as well, and what we refer to as the dynamic curve. In other words, sometimes a particular road or area is used for, schools or freight drop-off. Sometimes it's used for other pieces in the evenings. It might be very different again based on the nighttime economy. Again, technology can provide the platforms to support us to do that. So why is all this important? Well, ultimately, all these things are about getting people to engage with alternatives to the private car, mostly. And there's all sorts of benefits that come from that. The obvious ones around environment and health, I think, are key. But there are big advantages as well to play in the access and inclusivity realm as well, where technology can really help to support that. I appreciate that it can work the other way, and we've got to be very, very careful that we don't create a technology gap as well. But there are ways of overcoming that. One, through education, but two, also through running parallel streams, if you like, alongside more traditional communication technologies, telephone, whatever it might be, to allow these to go out. From an operator perspective, it's about efficiency and sustainability, using technology to take what they've got and make it better. Mass and technology is not going to magic up modes, right? If the modes don't exist, they don't exist. But it allows us to do a lot more with what we have. I think that's a really important bit. And of course, all of this ultimately is about supporting the economy more generally and the benefits that can come from that. So that's me, very whistle-stop tour of technology and where it might play a role over the next 12 months. If you're more interested in technology and maths in general, then please do get in touch and I'll happily answer any questions at the end.
Great, well, thanks very much, Ali. I really appreciated that presentation. I'm sure our audience will too. I think as you say, people have got varying levels of understanding of maths, and some will have heard of it, some won't. I think my concern has always been that it didn't quite say where things like community transport fit in. So I think you've done a really good job in showing something that can seem quite abstract to us. Actually, there is a role for community-led services and for the community to be part of that kind of different, I was going to say bigger picture, but actually it's a different picture of how we might travel in future. So I appreciate that. I'm now going to move to our third contributor, who is Jan Garrell. Jan is the Chief Executive of Two Ridings Community Foundation. Well, I said at the beginning that our interest is in as much as in transport and as it is in community, and as much in community as in transport. I think it's great having Jan along, because Jan's background is in both transport and community through various things that she's worked in the past, Stagecoach, Tyne and Wear Passenger Transport Authority, and now most recently a community foundation. So welcome, Jan.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks for inviting me along here. Thanks to Ali and Mark for their really interesting presentations. I've not got a presentation, I'm just going to talk about my perspective. For those of you who don't know, Two Ridings Community Foundation is based in North and East Yorkshire. And there's a community foundation everywhere across the UK. There are 46 of us. So there will be someone like me in your place. And we are a local funder of grassroots activities, smaller charitable activity organisations based in their communities. And I'm going to talk, hopefully for about 10 minutes, about the funder perspective of what we've seen from the experience of COVID. And I'll try to draw some conclusions and ask some questions for community transport, both practice and policy. So the Two Ridings experience, the lens of a funder and the lens of place. So we've distributed nearly £2 million in grants to over 300 organisations since March 18th, when we went into lockdown. And of that, at least £140,000 has gone towards transport needs, whether that's community transport providers or organisations using minibuses within community spaces. And interestingly, Bill and I did some analysis, and 50% of the grants that went to community transport organisations during COVID came from community foundations. One of the challenges for us is capturing that data in a way, and it's a lesson for me, is that we probably need to capture that data better. But we've funded organisations in Boroughbridge and Gould to make vehicles COVID safe, to allow community transport providers to become delivery services, whether that's food or medicines, in Rydale, Gould, Reeth, Beverley, and in the S Valley. And we've also covered loss of income for some community organisations. When usually in the past we've not been able to do that, but through COVID and through the £2.5 million we raised, we could do that. And interestingly, what we're seeing is that collaboration between community transport providers and communities is really starting to create some new opportunities in North and East Yorkshire. I think, and this has been really useful for me, reflecting on community transport, because I think one of the challenges for community transport and one of the big questions for the future is a lot of funders tend to fund project activity. They don't fund running costs. There aren't that many funders who will just simply put money into paying overheads. And often a lot of organisations use fundraising efforts to do that, and obviously that's gone with COVID. So is the system for funding sustainable for community transport organisations? When I mean funding, I mean trusts and foundations. And how well do community transport organisations stand up against other projects when they're in competition for funding? So I'm thinking about, in a place like North Yorkshire and East Riding, two of the most rural counties in England, where austerity has impacted significantly, and particularly I think on transport. And a recent submission to the North Yorkshire Rural Commission from the Hamilton and Richmondshire Rural Transport and Access Partnership talks about outdated modes of transport provision, a lack of integration, barriers to people, significant gaps in consultation, and narrow views from funders about what is essential travel. But interestingly, they presented that aspect of transport from a human rights lens, and I think, picking up on some of what Mark and Ali was saying, can you help communicate the value of community transport through the benefits it brings around health and social economic well-being? And I think COVID has shown that there is a big, strong case to be made there. And that's one of the questions I would pose, as post where we are now, is how well can you do that? So as I mentioned, community foundations, like a lot of funders, normally fund project costs. And for this presentation, I had a quick look at something called 360 Giving, where lots of funders, I think over 150 funders, put all their grant making onto an open data platform so it can be accessible to everyone. And I did an analysis of community transport and funding. And I think, and it's only a back of a fag packet calculation, I think community transport is underfunded by trusts and foundations. There's some funding for activity, but a relatively crude scan indicates that in 2019, and I deliberately did this pre-COVID, that if you compare community transport funding, it was circa 2.3 million in 2019. Whereas if I searched on themes like loneliness or isolation, it was much higher. Loneliness identified about £25 million, isolation identified about £72 million. Now, I don't know enough about community transport funding models in terms of public subsidy and DFT grants. So it might not mean that trust and foundation grant funding is needed, but I'd hazard a guess it will help, and it certainly has in 2020. So I wonder, one of my big questions is, does COVID-19 and the experience of 2020 give community transport providers the evidence that community transport is, as Bill says, as much about community as about transport, and make that better funding case to trusts and foundations. And really interestingly, I'm part of a stakeholder group around health and care partnerships in our region. And I see there's a growing recognition that the part that the voluntary community sector can play in the health and social care world. Partly that's pragmatic because it's lower cost provision, but also it's based on the fact that it's much more about prevention and early intervention than the current medical model of health and social care. So again, is that an opportunity for community transport providers to work in their local place with their partners that they've established and built on in 2020 to say to funders and health and social care providers, look what we do to improve the health and well-being of people. It's not just transport for transport's sake, it's for the well-being of an area and of people. So the other areas where I think there's lots of big questions are around policy. And for me, and coming from a rural area, I know community transport is not synonymous with rural, but for me it is. I think there's a much stronger evidence base needed and a less siloed approach around thinking about rural. I've been talking to the North Yorkshire Rural Commission and suggesting they think about take a lens of place as opposed to services. And I think then you could talk about the benefits of the wider economy. I also think that the government's approach to farming post-Brexit is a nod to a different way of viewing rural activity. It's talking more about stewardship of place and sustainment. And I think if you think about community transport, like a number of community provision in a rural place, they're a critical element of the social infrastructure in a rural place that keeps the economy, whether that's the working economy, the tourism economy, the visitor economy, they keep that going in a very effective way. And I'm also a member of the North Yorkshire and York Local Enterprise Partnership, and I'm constantly making the case for community and within that community transport. And the other big question here, and that is interesting, Ali and Mark both mentioned it, is around data. As I mentioned, 360 Giving was transformational for funders to have their grant-making data in an open data format accessible to everyone. And what that's led to is more exploration around data alongside other partners to look at what's the data showing us, what if we bring data sets together, with people, what answers can it make to some of the questions about how can we do things differently? And I wonder, and this is interesting where, as an opportunity, I'm just throwing it out as a funding opportunity, 360 Giving do something called data expeditions, where they bring people together from a wider community of practice and activity, could be community transport, to look at what's the data saying alongside people, whether it's service providers or service users, to say, is there something different we can do? How's the data helping us rethink what we do? So there's some of my thoughts for the big questions. So in conclusion, what are the bridges to the future? What are the things that community transport could use COVID-19 and the experience of 2020 to amplify? How can it amplify the things you've done in terms of working better with communities and closer? The value of community transport to communities. How different relationships can be built with funders. What's the contribution of community transport to rural areas and other areas, social infrastructure, and how might data help get a deeper understanding and open up some different opportunities? And finally, the only thing I want to say is you, like many people in the community and voluntary sector, have worked really, really hard, turning services overnight into different services to respond to need. We see that daily in the applications we receive. So I'd just like to say a big thank you to all of you. And also, the one thing I'm very conscious of is everybody's working really incredibly hard, and that there is a huge risk to people around burnout. And I do hope that you can take a break over Christmas and look after yourselves and have a bit of a respite, because we've still got a lot more to do in 2021. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Jan. That's some really good ideas there and some calls to action and things we can take forward. And I think across all of our presentations where we've heard about the need to plan, the need to think about where we fit in some of these conversations about what transport looks like, or the way in which we can, as Jan says, create a conversation around people's rights and how we create better places and are engaged in prevention and some of those other agendas that do attract the attention of policymakers and funders. So plenty to think about. Rachel, have you got anything to share from what you've been reading in the chat, or any questions coming up?
People are listening in awe. I think the chat is pretty quiet. Guys, do share any thoughts or ideas or questions that you do have. We have had a point from Stephen, which I think is a really great one, of the fact that all these restrictions on our sector have come on top of all the problems we already had, particularly around local authority funding, budgets being shrunk year on year. So it'd be interesting to kind of hear what the panel think about that issue, that it's not been plain sailing and then 2020's hit. We've had struggles before this. How do we kind of, and more things coming through, how do we navigate this going into 2021?
Yeah, so does anyone want to come in on that? So yeah, what people have experienced this year, it wasn't necessarily rosy before. So what do they need to be thinking about?
Can I just comment? I think we've seen the impact of austerity on communities in our region, and I think community transport has had a particular bad hit. And I think it's so, I think there's been a pivot and a reset with the relationship with the voluntary community sector as a result of COVID, and I think that may shift. So, for example, in North Yorkshire, the local authorities have set up 23 community hubs, which have been produced faster than it was always wanted to do, and they were all based in community and voluntary sector organisations, and many of those have within them an existing community transport provision. So I think there's something there that it would start to show more clearly the value of community transport in a local place to people like local authorities. I think the challenge is that their funding is even tighter than ever.
Any else want to come in on that? We don't have to give us a wave, or we can take any other comments or questions. Rachel, if there's anything, I don't think necessarily have to have every question answered by every panel member. There might be some which are more appropriate to direct to one or two.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd just say in the chat, Dylan's just put the link for members on how to find your community foundation. So we can add that to the blog that comes from this event, because I think people will really appreciate seeing that. Paddy's made a comment referencing Jan's point around 2020 giving the sector a better opportunity to show value, and mentioned the Northern Irish report that CTA did with members. So I think we can share that again as well, because I think people will really appreciate seeing that. And we're doing something similar. Paddy, I'm seeing you this challenging your IT skills. Don't worry about that. We can sort that. I actually had a question around data, because all three of you really have focused kind of on the need for that data to be great for passengers, for CTs, and I think as well, when you're reporting into whatever funding body that might be, the need for that data. But I think lots of members are so busy with the day job that it can often take a back seat. Do you have any advice or any just techniques to kind of make our relationship with data a wee bit easier? I'm not looking for a CRM recommendation, but just kind of what we can do to maybe change that relationship a wee bit.
I think, as I would say, I think that's where the technology platforms can help to do that, because I think it's potentially quite a labour-intensive process. It's and certainly if we're looking ahead to any form of integration, that becomes more and more difficult. But I think there are platforms that will allow that to happen really much more easily than you might think. And I think that would be one of the key things. Sorry, just briefly on the last point, but related to local authorities, or in this case, regional transport partnerships in Scotland. It was interesting to me that in the last 24 hours, actually, Sestran, who are the regional transport partnership for the southeast of Scotland, they're applying, well, it looks like they're going to be applying for funding through the Scottish Government's Mass Investment Fund, so that's obviously built around mobility as a service. But in their call to partners, they explicitly called to community transport operators. So they're very, very keen to hear from them. So they clearly see that mode as being a key part of that mix. They're looking for a regional integrated, service, and they're specifically calling out community transport to be part of that. So I thought that was quite an interesting development. I've not seen that before in other mass projects, but I thought it was an interesting one from Sestran.
Yeah, no, I mean, just to come back on that from a purely Scottish policy point of view, work on DRT has really kind of been focused on the fact that mass can play such a big role in that, with CT. So I'm not surprised to hear that they're making that point. So we've got some more chat going on. Maggie makes a really good point that health people are still not getting it about the benefits of CT. And as a sector, how can we get this value across to them more clearly? Jan, are you able to come in on that one?
Yeah, I think it's about selling the benefit, the impact, rather than selling CT. And I'm sorry if it sounds like I'm telling you how to do a job. It's not meant to be that, but all health services are challenged around getting people in and out of hospital, managing hospital waiting lists, and I think it's getting involved in the networks and the partnerships that are in your place, whether it's through the integrated health and care partners, and finding out what the challenges are and thinking about how community transport can address that and coming up with some solutions. There's a real opportunity, as I mentioned. It's about both addressing the lower cost base that that can be provided that way, but also the preventative element. So I think that's really important. Every health and care partnership is really challenged about long-term waiting lists. They're really facing 52 weeks and more waiting lists as a result of coronavirus, and so they're really responsive to how they can keep people in the community involved in preventative measures or support measures to keep them going whilst they're on their waiting list. So I think it's just trying to get into those networks and think about the opportunities that might arise.
That's really interesting what you say about networks, because I asked a question in the chat of members of what will they bring with them into 2021 that they've been doing this year. And we've had a message in from John kind of making that exact point of better integration with other transport providers, finding groups that have set up during coronavirus. So it's really interesting to hear you say, is that networking piece? Because I think that's something that's really coming out quite clearly in the chat as a recipe for success as well.
While Rachel's just having a look at those points in the chat, I was going to ask a question, perhaps one which be interesting, for any of you have got a perspective on. So one of the challenge when we're asked, we're called upon to think about the future, is that we're right up against it with very immediate things. If people are worried about what's happening today, tomorrow, next week, then they might perceive they haven't got time for next year. How can we help each other and help people just free up some space in our minds to even think about doing things differently in the future? Anyone want to come in on that?
I wish I could. I'm not sure I've got an answer. I think it's one of the biggest barriers to any kind of development is exactly that people just can't free up enough headspace to begin to contemplate it when they're fighting their own fires. That's not helping at all, is it? But
that's okay. Anybody else? Mark, you think?
Yeah, I talked about this at the start, talking about the scenario planning kind of activities and things. I think if you can set aside some time, whereas a dedicated time where you could actually, get people together from different perspectives to think about, we're going to have to look and think further ahead, because the danger is, if you, we were experiencing the dangers or the reaction to that in the sense that if you don't do that ongoingly, if you don't check in on periodically and think, well, what about the longer term? What about the future? You end up just kind of sleepwalking into where we are now, kind of thing. So we can't just go on a business as usual. That's been proven now. So I think in some ways a crisis situation gives us that jolt to think, well, actually, let's stop just relying on our traditional practices and think that we have to dedicate time, because actually, if we don't do that, we're not going to develop solutions that are robust against a range of, alternatives that we can't at this stage, definitely say are going to happen.
Thank you.
Yeah, we use, because we're thinking about what it's meaning for us, and you're absolutely right, it's hard when you're busy dealing with the day stuff. But the RSA have got a really good framework where they've got a matrix, and they talk about what things have stopped during crisis and what things have started, and what one of those things you'd have to pick back up again or keep going. And it's just a really simple little quadrant. And I think it does think some of the things that we've done, because we've obviously, like everyone, we've moved to a lot of paperless ways of working out of necessity, but we want to keep those because that's a good way in terms of sustainability and working. But there are some things that we've had to do that we know we need to stop once we go back to a new normal way. But there are lots of things we want to keep, and it's just reflecting on what's helped and what's not helped.
That sounds. I'll check that out. I'm a big fan of changing the one 4-box matrix at a time.
Yeah.
So, I'll be sure to have a look at that. Anything we're seeing, or do you want to have a look at the poll, Rachel?
Yeah, of course, absolutely. I would just say that Anissa has just shared the framework in the chat, so if people do want to have a wee look at that, that is there. I just wanted to put in one last member comment, which is from John again, kind of reflecting really on what you said, Jan, about taking that pause and the need to do that, particularly where we've got quite a few sort of one-person shows in our sector with lots of volunteer support. It is so important to take a wee pause. And that pause doesn't have to be a webinar. Let's just have a wee look at this poll and see where we got to. So thank you to everybody who took part in it. And let me share the results with you. You should be able to see that. The winner, and I think we all know this, don't we, has been being on mute when you were speaking, and vice versa. Like we've all said, you're on mute the whole way through this, so that it's good to see what people are doing, and all the walking.
50% of people are lying. I guarantee that's 100%.
Oh dear. Yeah, so no, I mean, I was quite surprised actually that more people hadn't cut or coloured their own hair. You've got a lot more patience than I did. I did some bad fringe work earlier in the lockdown, so you're all far more self-controlled.
Yeah, haven't they?
There we go. I'll hand back over.
COVID beards weren't on the list of things you could do.
I didn't think about those, but that's a good point.
Well, to close then, I think we've looked at kind of some big picture stuff. I suppose that if any of the panel have got some of the smaller stuff you've seen personally that you feel that is a good thing and you'd like to keep hold of things that have been sort of happening during COVID. It'd be great if you could share those as we wrap up. Anyone want to step in? So something that you personally have seen or experienced that you think, yeah, we need to keep hold of that.
It's a bit anti-transport, but I do like the fact that I've been on a call this morning with colleagues from across Europe, because we're now working on a pan-European project, and it's so much easier to do. So that's something I do want to hold on to, but equally I do want to get out more as well.
Excellent. Thank you, Jan. Mark,
I was going to say the working from home aspect. You can have too much of it, absolutely, and we'll get cabin fever, I'm sure. But I think just that the time that you save on not sitting in traffic and commuting and stuff is very valuable. So I think a more balanced mix of home working and working in the office is what I would look forward to anyway.
Thanks, Mark. Ali?
Yeah, it's difficult to argue with that. I think that the way that people will approach work, I think, will change, and it's probably predominantly for the better. I think there is a balance to be struck, and I think we're too far one way at the moment, but we will come back gradually the other way. The other thing for me, and it might sound a bit twee, is that I've really enjoyed, maybe it's an indictment of where I was before, but the sense of community that we've had round about here, the fact that I know my neighbours now more than I did 9 months ago, and that's just true. It's just, and I live in a fairly large suburban town, but there's been absolutely no doubt that I've seen a big shift over the last kind of 6 months or so on that. It's been great.
Brilliant, thank you. Rachel, go on, I'm going to ask you, have you got anything?
All right, I was going to say volunteering. There's been loads of volunteering around about our area. You know, I live in pretty central Edinburgh, so you can feel not such a great sense of community. And actually, there've just been little bits and bobs fly through the door to say if you need any support or anyone to talk to. It's lovely. I have missed though seeing the CT that picks the old lady up who lives underneath me come and pick her up and her go off. It's always kind of felt really nice working at home and seeing her go off for the day. So I do miss that, but hopefully she'll be back out soon.
All right, well, thank you very much. And thanks to everyone. Just a couple of things. Members will have got an email this morning from us, written by Peter Hardy, who is a trustee and chair of our policy committee. And we're recruiting new people along to our policy committee. So if you enjoy these kind of chats, want to join a group that talks about where CT fits in with different things, helps us respond to consultations, then that recruitment stuff's gone out today. And we're really looking forward to more members coming forward to be part of that. We do have got certainly our advice drop-in again this Friday. John Taylor's coming along to that for those who are signed up or want to come along. And then next week we've got, probably is our final kind of public event of the year, is our celebration event for our Connecting Communities in Wales project that you're welcome to sign up to as well. So thanks to our speakers, thanks to you all for coming along. I've found it really interesting, our events. We always say we want to inform, involve and inspire, and I think our speakers and what we've had in the chat today has done all of those three things. So thanks very much, and yeah, hope everyone, as Jan says, gets a chance to have a break and a good time with family, friends and whoever they're in touch with over the Christmas period. So see you all soon and take care.